but because certain truths were deliberately removed. Ancient myths from unrelated cultures describe remarkably similar disasters: floods that reset the world, fire falling from the sky, long periods of darkness, and civilizations wiped away almost overnight. For centuries, these stories were dismissed as allegory or superstition, but modern science has begun to uncover physical evidence that aligns disturbingly well with those myths. The third category is perhaps the most unsettling: suppressed knowledge about human consciousness and perception. Practitioners were silenced. Why? Because knowledge shapes behavior, and behavior shapes power. If people understood themselves differently, if they saw consciousness as something expansive rather than limited systems built on control, would weaken. This leads to a disturbing pattern. Knowledge that empowers individuals tends to vanish. Knowledge that reinforces hierarchy tends to survive. That doesn't require a global conspiracy. It only requires consistent incentives. The final layer of buried history involves artifacts that challenge the accepted origin of humanity itself, from anomalous fossils found in impossible geological layers to tools discovered far older than our species should be capable of producing. The record contains uncomfortable outliers. Rather than rewrite the narrative, many of these discoveries were quietly reclassified, ignored, or explained away as contamination or misinterpretation. In science, anomalies should inspire investigation. In history, anomalies often disappear, because history is not just about what happened, it's about what we allow ourselves to believe happened. The forbidden knowledge isn't a single secret document or hidden archive. It's a pattern of advanced capability appearing too early, a pattern of catastrophic resets, a pattern of consciousness-based knowledge being erased, a pattern of anomalies being quietly sidelined. Together, they suggest a version of humanity far older, more complex, and more cyclical than the story we were taught. And if that version is true, then we are not a young species slowly climbing toward greatness. We are survivors, inheritors of a past that was deliberately simplified. This doesn't mean history is a lie. It means history is incomplete, and the most dangerous knowledge is not what is false, but what is missing. Because once you begin to see the gaps, you can never unsee them. And the next part of this investigation reveals something even more troubling. Not just what was buried, but why it was buried so effectively. History feels permanent. Books are written, dates are memorized, timelines are taught, as if they were carved into stone. But history is not a record of everything that happened. It is a record of what survived. And survival, in historical terms, is rarely neutral. Every civilization that controlled writing, education, or archives controlled memory itself. To decide what is remembered is to decide what is real. And throughout history, that power has been used deliberately. The second layer of forbidden knowledge isn't hidden in ancient ruins. It's hidden in who was allowed to speak and who was erased. When centralized power emerges, whether religious, political, or imperial, one of its first priorities is narrative control. Competing versions of reality are dangerous. They create doubt. They weaken authority. So they are removed. Libraries are burned. Texts are labeled heretical. Ideas are rebranded as superstition. This has happened repeatedly across cultures and centuries. One of the most striking examples is the systematic destruction of ancient knowledge centers. The most famous, the Library of Alexandria, was not just a building full of books. It was a repository of alternative histories, scientific observations, and philosophical traditions from multiple civilizations. When such centers disappear, knowledge docente, hust banis, continuity vanishes. Later generations inherit fragments, disconnected ideas without context, and when context is lost, interpretation becomes easy to manipulate. Another mechanism of burial is classification. Not censorship. Classification. Knowledge deemed unimportant, mythological, or unscientific is quietly removed from serious study. It remains accessible, but stripped of credibility. Once something is labeled myth, it stops being investigated. This is especially relevant when ancient texts describe advanced understanding of astronomy, geometry, or the mind. Rather than ask how such knowledge was acquired, it is often dismissed as symbolic or exaggerated. Yet modern science has repeatedly rediscovered principles that were described symbolically thousands of years ago. Planetary cycles, precession of the equinoxes, mathematical constants, psychological archetypes. When rediscovered, these ideas are celebrated without acknowledging their ancient origins. This creates an illusion of linear progress. It suggests humanity started ignorant and slowly climbed toward understanding. But the evidence hints at something far more unsettling. Knowledge may rise and fall. And when it falls, it doesn't disappear completely. It becomes dangerous. The third mechanism of suppression is instead of destroying knowledge, institutions absorb it and strip it of meaning. Practices once associated with consciousness exploration become ritual. Observations of the mind become religion. Technologies without explanation become ceremonial. Once reframed, they are no longer taken seriously. This allows history to keep the artifacts while losing the understanding behind them. The result is a sanitized past, a version of humanity that appears primitive, obedient, and slowly awakening, rather than capable, curious, and periodically reset. Why does this matter? Because history shapes identity. If humans were once more advanced than we are told, technologically, psychologically, or socially, then modern civilization is not the peak. It is a recovery, and that realization threatens systems built on the assumption that now is the most enlightened moment that has ever existed. Another uncomfortable truth emerges when we examine who funded early historical research. Much of what became official history was shaped during periods of empire. Archaeology, anthropology, and historiography were often guided by political interests. Discoveries that reinforced national narratives were celebrated. Discoveries that contradicted them were sidelined. This doesn't require malicious intent. Bias is enough. When careers funding and prestige depend on maintaining a coherent narrative, anomalies become liabilities. They slow progress. They complicate stories. They raise questions no one wants to answer. So they are postponed, reinterpreted, or forgotten. Over time, the absence becomes normalized. Future generations assume nothing is missing because they never knew it existed. This leads to a deeply uncomfortable question. How much of what we believe about human history is the result of absence rather than evidence? And how many gaps exist, not because answers were never found, but because they were inconvenient? The forbidden knowledge isn't a single secret. It's an accumulation of silences. Silences created by power, convenience, and fear of destabilizing established worldviews. And once silence hardens into tradition, challenging it becomes almost impossible, because questioning history feels like questioning reality itself. But science has taught us something crucial. Reality does not care about comfort. Truth does not align itself with stability. And progress often begins with anomalies that refuse to disappear. In the final part of this investigation, we confront the most unsettling implication of all. What if the buried knowledge isn't just about the past, but about what humanity is capable of becoming again? If everything you've seen so far is true, then the most disturbing realization isn't that history was edited. It's why it was edited. Because buried knowledge isn't just about ancient stones, forgotten technologies, or lost texts. It is about human potential, and how dangerous that potential can be to systems built on control. When we examine the patterns across history, a quiet truth begins to emerge. Civilizations don't simply collapse due to ignorance. They collapse after reaching thresholds of complexity. Advanced knowledge creates advanced risks. Technology amplifies power. Psychological insight amplifies influence. Understanding consciousness amplifies autonomy, and autonomy is difficult to govern. This may explain why certain forms of knowledge vanish repeatedly, not once, but across cultures separated by oceans and centuries. Knowledge about inner experience, knowledge about collective behavior, knowledge about cycles of rise and collapse. Ancient societies seemed obsessed with cycles, ages of creation and destruction, golden eras, followed by dark resets. These weren't abstract myths, they were warnings. Modern history prefers linear stories. Progress, advancement, mastery. But linear stories are easier to control. Cyclical stories imply responsibility. They imply recurrence. They imply that mistakes return. If humanity has risen and fallen before, technologically, socially, or cognitively, then we are not unique. We are repeating. This reframes forbidden knowledge in a way that is far more unsettling than conspiracy. What if nothing was hidden to keep us ignorant, but to keep us manageable? If people believed their ancestors were capable of far more than they are taught, if they understood that consciousness itself may be expandable, then obedience would weaken. Not violently, but psychologically. People who see themselves as limited behave differently than those who see themselves as inheritors of something vast. This is why certain discoveries trigger discomfort rather than celebration. Out-of-place artifacts, advanced astronomical alignments, ancient maps that appear to show impossible accuracy. Each one threatens the same assumption, that modern humans are the pinnacle. But history suggests a different narrative, that humanity doesn't move forward in a straight line. It does. Knowledge accumulates. Society destabilizes. Collapse occurs. Fragments survive. And from those fragments, a new civilization resurges, convinced it is starting from nothing. This cycle doesn't require secret organizations. It requires forgetting, and forgetting happens naturally when catastrophe strikes. Floods don't preserve libraries. Fires don't protect data. Social collapse doesn't reward nuance. Only simplified stories survive. Over time, those stories harden into doctrine, and doctrine resists revision. This is where forbidden knowledge becomes dangerous, not because it proves a hidden truth, but because it reopens possibility. It reminds us that humanity is not static, that intelligence is not fixed, that consciousness is not fully mapped, that our current models are provisional. This doesn't mean ancient humans were gods. It doesn't mean modern science is wrong. It means both may be incomplete, and incompleteness is where curiosity thrives and control weakens. The final question, then, is not whether history was edited. It's whether we are ready to edit it again, honestly, to acknowledge gaps without filling them with comfort, to accept uncertainty without turning it into fear, to study anomalies without rushing to erase them. Because forbidden knowledge doesn't ask us to believe. It asks us to reconsider, and that may be the most radical act of all. If humanity's past is more complex than we were taught, then our future is less predictable than we assume, and that future depends on whether we repeat the cycle or finally understand it. If you want to keep exploring the edge where real history, science, and mystery intersect without easy answers and without fear, subscribe to SeventhMyst, because some truths weren't buried to stay hidden forever. They were buried until we were ready to ask the right questions.